a story that's an extraordinarily important one. There's a lot of opportunity here. It's this extraordinary opportunity not only in the near term, but I think in a longer term basis. But it's occurring at a time of immense challenge. And what I'd like to do is, as I've done in previous years, give you an overview as to where we see things going, where we got here, and where we're going, and how the region fits in, and how this particular event fits into a future that I think is extraordinarily bright for this region. But we've gone a long way over the last year. You may remember a year ago when I was here, we talked a little bit about the subprime crisis. Everybody was focused on issues in the U.S., the fact that the U.S. housing market was going through an enormous setback. We knew by then that some of the banks in the U.S. were in big trouble because of the subprime crisis. But it appeared to be largely a U.S. problem. It was in a box that some leakage had occurred into other countries, but it largely was a U.S. problem. Within a couple of months of this event last year, it had become a larger one. Germany, France, Italy, Japan were all showing signs of going into recession. Their financial institutions were coming under stress. And as I mentioned last year, the key reason for that was that this whole subprime mess was a very large mess, because roughly a quarter of all new mortgages in the U.S. In the period 2004-2007 have been subprime in characteristics being no money down, no principal payments, not necessarily proving you have income to support the mortgage. That was an inconvenient truth that blossomed up into a big problem when those mortgages were sold around the world, sold across Canada, sold to credit unions, municipalities, sold everywhere. But we were still looking on this problem as though it were a flat screen TV someplace else at a body experience, in part because we had some very strong advantages in this country. We also had something else going on, and that was an enormous amount of revenues coming into the door because of a commodity boom that was unprecedented. And Tony could tell you the impact of commodity revenues on Government of Canada finances, now obviously big in the West, but as those revenues were coming in and redistributed across the country in a variety of ways and linkages into industries, we had a big cushion. But something happened last August, September, and October to turn it from an out-of-body experience into something much more personal. And that was the evidence that emerging countries were slowing down, and effectively they were the big demanders of the products, the resource products that Canada sells from Northern Ontario, from Alberta, from BC, and the like. And when gasoline prices went down from $1.30 a liter down to 85 cents or whatever it was, in the initial months we all jumped for joy. This was a great relief, but at the same time it was indicative of a clouding sky that was coming over our economy. And as I traveled across the country, it was those months, September, October, November, that were really the pivotal months for Canada, in which economic conditions here began to deteriorate as well, because it wasn't a U.S. problem, or it wasn't a developed world problem, or it wasn't an emerging world problem. It was a global one. And in fact, the key characteristic, I think, of the setback has been that all developed countries in the world are now in recession. All emerging countries in the world are showing a very substantial slowdown. So, what's it like? Is it like the early 90s, the early 80s? Can we go back to the 60s? Well, if you're 100 years old or more, you might remember a time when we've had this type of economic dislocation, but certainly in my working life, which spans about 35 years, there's nothing that precedents to this. The good news is Canada is favoring much better than other countries, and will continue to do so, mind you. The bad news is we are part of the global economy, so the economic conditions will change. Now, what's happening beyond the economic setback that we read about in the paper or see on TV every day? In our view, and it was my view last year, that there's another characteristic of what's happening in the global economy, and that is the setback will have longevity. As a matter of fact, that was the central message I delivered a year ago. And the reason is fairly straightforward. Let's go back to that subprime issue just for a very brief moment. You're buying a house down in Florida. Let's say it's 3 years ago. Maybe you're working for Circuit City at the time. You feel you have pretty good job prospects. You've firm. And you go in and you see a $600,000 house that really looks like the one you've always wanted, and it's a bit of a stretch. You don't want to pay any money in certain ways, and we are. We have the strongest banking system in the world, and that may seem like a little bit of a press snippet that you see a while, but it matters to everybody. Because banks are enablers of growth in good periods of time, because the credit is needed to, for example, allow businesses to expand. In many parts of the world, businesses are not finding banks really able to help them out right now. Certainly in the U.S., there's a big problem. In the U.K. as well, parts of Europe. And in essence, what has happened is financial institutions in many countries have become disablers of growth. In Canada, credit is still growing. There are problems with respect to credit. There are many businesses that used to put credit into the economy that are simply not open for business right now. But on a relative basis, the financial system being the strongest in the world is very important longer term. Our households are in better shape as well. Canadian households have been adding to equity over the last 15 years at a time where U.S. homeowners have tended to look at their home equity as an alternative to a credit card and build up on debt on the basis of home equity loans. Consumers have less debt service payments. Also, the average household has better job prospects on the side of the border. Think of what's happened in the U.S. over the last year. 3.5 million jobs have been lost, and it's just getting going. 3.5 million jobs, it would have been more, but there is an area of very rapid gain in employment south of the border. It's called involuntary part-time. It's growing like gangbusters. Effectively, people want to work full-time and they can't find those opportunities. In Canada, on a year-over-year basis, the latest month, employment is actually slightly up. We were creating jobs until the fall. But as I said, when the emerging world began to show signs of crack and commodity prices began coming down, the economic consequences were profound. I was just out in Calgary. You can see it there very, very strongly. Roughly $9 billion worth of spending that was supposed to occur in the energy patch is not going to occur this year because of the decline in oil prices. So the impact is fairly immediate. But we have a stronger household balance sheet, stronger employment situation on the side of the border. The third thing, and this sometimes gets lost in the press, but is very fundamentally important, is we have an extraordinarily stronger fiscal setting in this country. Now, when you heard Jim Flaherty stand up and say we're going to run a $34 billion deficit, I imagine many of you were in a bit of sticker shock. And I suspect when Dwight Duncan stands up and says in Ontario we have a $10 billion deficit, you're going to be a little nervous as well, because we don't hear those things very much in this country anymore. A $34 billion deficit is 2% of GDP. President Obama yesterday brought down a budget that will have a deficit that is roughly 12% of GDP. Is there a comparison? There's no comparison at all. Over the last dozen years, we've been running surpluses, effectively strengthening our balance sheet. The U.S., since the end of the 1990s, has been going in the other direction. U.S. deficits will continue to rise. $2 trillion, I suspect, in the coming year.